Welcome to Thought Talk with best-selling author Karen Tiber Leland, founder of Sterling Marketing Group and author of the brand mapping strategy, Design, Build, and Accelerate Your Brand. Join us as Karen interviews today's top thought leaders from the worlds of business, art, technology, science, and entertainment. Karen explores the top-of-the-line thinking that makes each guest a leader in their field.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thought Talk. My guest today is Laura Huang. She is a professor at Harvard Business School, and she is the author of the new book, Edge, Turning Adversity into Advantage. And right now we're in the middle of the coronavirus, so I would say we're definitely in an adversity stage. And so we're going to talk about advantage today. Laura, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
I know one of the things we were going to talk about today was overcoming gender adversity in the workplace and how women can use their unique edge to navigate today's workplace. And we are going to talk about that. But given the givens and given the situation we're in, I really want to ask you how what you've talked about in your work applies to what's going on now and what everybody needs to be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote about adversity, there was lots of different adversity that I was sort of writing about, but I did not think that this was one of the types of adversity that would be so salient to what this book was about. But it certainly applies because so much of what we're dealing right now is not just adversity in the typical definition of the world, but just constraint and change and differences in terms of how we need to operate and how we need to interact with each other. And there's really, for who knows how long, we're going to have this sort of new normal. And we need to be able to understand what this situation is about, as well as find ways to turn this in our favor. We need to be able to operate not just as well as we were before, but find unique ways that we can operate in even better ways. So it's something that is on everyone's mind right now, including my own.
Yeah, and I agree, and that's something I've been doing a lot of coaching with my clients on. And one of the things I want to ask you is for people that are still going to work, because, there are people that are still physically showing up in their workplace. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ways that you think they need to deal with the adversity that they may be facing in a live work situation? And then the same question about the adversity people are facing and dealing with doing their work from home.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so key, because when we have this sort of nationwide or worldwide crisis, we tend to often put ourselves in our own shoes and not be thinking that there's so many different nuances. There's so many different ways that this is playing out for people. So one of the things that's so key is understanding where is everybody, where am I coming from, and from what perspective am I coming from, and what perspective are others coming from. So there's absolutely those people who their day-to-day job per se has not changed, right? They still have to be going to work. They still have to be engaging in the same sorts of work activities. But the nature of that has changed. They have to be more vigilant about the way in which they conduct that business. There's also parts of what they're doing that they need to be adapting in terms of how they interact with others, but also thinking about how they're going to go forward. Can they sustain this? In what ways can they sustain this? So, a lot of it is around understanding what is the need here. And how can they deliver on that need in the best way they can? And so what I suggest and what I've been telling sort of students and people that I've been speaking with about this is, in both cases, those of us who still have to be doing our day-to-day jobs and can't be remote, and those of us who now are sort of being forced to being remote, is go back to the basics. Go back to what are the basic goods that I need to be delivering here? What's the core 2 or 3 things that I need to be doing in my job or in my workplace? For example, if you're a professor, your core role as an educator is to be delivering content to your students in a way that's making them think and process and engage and learn. And if you don't have the opportunity to do that in a classroom now with experiential exercises and sort of the interactions in the classroom that you want to be doing, that doesn't mean that you automatically now try and replicate that on an online environment. So I see some people trying to replicate that by trying to do virtual breakout rooms and virtual exercises. And that might not necessarily hurt, but we need to think about different ways where, if at the crux of this is about making students engage with this material. Are there ways that we can do that online that might be different? Maybe it means shortening those online classes and just using those online, having them do work on their own individually outside of that online platform. And then when you're on that online platform, just doing more of a Q&A and a conversation. Whereas, because I see, some of my colleagues are saying, well, I was supposed to teach a 4-hour seminar. I was supposed to teach a 4-hour class. How am I ever going to move those 4 hours online?
Well, I think this is a really important point, which is it isn't an apples to apples.
No, it's not.
And I think this is true not just for teachers, but for small business people and people that are leaders that are running meetings. You have to rethink how to adjust what you were going to do for a different format. I think that's a really important point. I think one of the things that I liked in your book was you talk about that hard work matters, but it takes more than effort to achieve and maintain success. And it's something you call hard work plus. Can you just talk a little bit about what hard work plus is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the main premise of this book is that, we're taught from a really young age that success is about hard work. You look at super successful people and inevitably they'll mention, when we say, what's the secret to your success? Inevitably they'll mention hard work as one of those factors. And the thing is, hard work is critical, but hard work alone is not often enough. A lot of times we put in that hard work and it leaves us frustrated because, it doesn't always speak for itself. And so this book was really about, understanding that it's often about the signals and perceptions and stereotypes of others that are actually determining success. And if we can flip those stereotypes and obstacles in our favor, that's how we can find and create our own edge. And, edge, I talk about, this book is about how to gain an edge. But that edge actually stands for a framework that I've developed through, more than a decade of my research, where the EDGE are the components of this framework. The first E is for enrich, knowing how you enrich and provide value in any sort of context, regardless of what that context might be. The D is for delight. So how do you delight others? Because sometimes we don't even have that opportunity to enrich and show how we provide value. So when you're able to delight, that's the equivalent of, cracking that door open a little so you have the opportunity. But even when we enrich and delight, we need to guide. We need to guide the perceptions of others, be redirecting people to who we authentically are and how they see our strengths and how they see our alleged weaknesses. And that final E is for effort and hard work. And what I talk about is that hard work comes last. We often think that hard work comes first, that it'll speak for itself. But in fact, when you know how you enrich and delight and guide, that's when your hard work works harder for you. And that's that hard work plus.
You talked a lot in the book about female entrepreneurs and their challenges with that. Can you just talk, because at some point we all will get back to work and we all will be back in our offices, and the issues that we've been dealing with for the last number of years will be back when we're all back in offices together. And I know you talked a lot about female entrepreneurs, employees, and some of the challenges that they particularly have as women in the workplace, both as entrepreneurs and then as employees. Can you talk a little bit about the biases that they face and how to flip those?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there are definitely those biases that women are facing. And now in the current climate that we're in, there's just one extra variable now. And I always talk about how you switch one variable and everything sort of changes in terms of those perceptions and those stereotypes. So now when we're in a virtual versus non-virtual or online versus in-person world, there's all of these extra sort of things that are changing as well. But on a base level, some of my research that's looked at female entrepreneurs, what I found is that entrepreneurship is what's considered a masculine typed industry, that we have perceptions about who that ideal entrepreneur should be and what he or she should look like. And it's characteristics like assertiveness and risk-taking. And those are not qualities that are typically associated with women. Those are qualities that are typically assigned to men and masculine stereotypes. Mm-hmm. And so there's this lack of fit there's this lack of congruence when we think of females being in, for example, a high-tech startup. And so in the book, I talk about how when you understand those perceptions, you understand that, for example, the perception of you is that you're not competent because you're not seen as someone who is going to be risk-taking and aggressive, that you can flip those in your favor, that you can actually turn circumstances so that people can actually see that you in fact are. I'll give you a quick example of how this sort of works. I found that in some of my research, for example, women are more likely to be asked what are called prevention-focused questions, and men are more likely to be asked what are called promotion-focused questions. So prevention-focused questions are ones that deal with risk and competitors and sort of all of the sort of nitty-gritty risks that are associated with something.
Those are prevention questions.
Yeah, that's what women are more likely to get asked about, like, do you really think this business could make it? What about all these competitors? What about your product? It seems like your product isn't far enough along. Men are more likely to get asked promotion-focused questions, which is about the opportunity and the vision and how big you could take this. So it's like, what other products can you envision coming off of this? And what other customers would be interested in this? And so men have, when it comes down to who those investors are going to invest in, they're going to invest in that entrepreneur who's been able to say more about how big they're going to take this, how wonderful the opportunity is, how there's just this huge vision and opportunity. So what women can do is they can flip that. When they recognize that they're being asked a prevention-focused question, they answer it quickly, but then they flip it into a promotion-oriented response. So if they're asked about competitors, for example, they can say, yeah, there are lots of competitors in this market, but here's what we're able to do that our competitors are not. And this allows us to then gain a foothold into all of these other markets and these other opportunities. And then they sort of position themselves in a way where they're leveling the playing field. And what's so interesting about this is that both male and female investors are equally likely to be asking women these risk-focused questions.
Did you in your research find out why that was the case, why women get asked these prevention-oriented and men get asked these promotion-oriented questions?
I mean, a lot of it is around legitimacy and, capability. And so what we're essentially saying, because we don't see this congruence, it's not always explicit, we implicitly don't see this fit between the person and the organization that they're trying to start. And so we're trying to get information around, is this person competent? Are they able to answer these sort of questions? Whereas we assume that men are competent and able to, that there's this fit with the company. And so then we allow ourselves, we give them the benefit of the doubt, and then we ask them about sort of opportunities and other things. And so it's so critical to sort of understand not only who we are and the assets and the ways in which we provide value, but also having a really clear understanding of how we're being perceived by others so that we can flip those perceptions in our favor.
Interesting. One of the other things by the way, I think what you just said about the promotion-oriented versus the, what was the other one? The prevention-oriented.
Yeah.
I think that's something that every entrepreneur needs to be aware of, whether they're being asked a question or not.
Yeah.
And just make sure that you're not always speaking from the prevention-oriented place, but that you do a balance of both.
That's right. That's right.
Another thing that you talk about in the books is that judgments are made about us quickly and they can be difficult to shift. Can you just talk a little bit actually, what we're going to do is take a break, and when we come back, that's what I'd love you to talk about. Okay.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. This is Karen Tiber Leland from Thought Talk. In these really difficult times, if you're concerned about how to keep your business on the upswing while the world seems to be on a downturn, feel free to give us a call at Sterling Marketing Group and do a Rent My Brain session. I'm offering these sessions right now at a 50% discount for anyone that wants to talk about bootstrap branding and micro marketing so that you can keep your business moving in really tough times. Just reach out to me at Karen@KarenLeland.com. So welcome back, everybody, with my guest, Laura Huang, and she is a professor at Harvard Business School and the author of the new book, Edge, Turning Adversity into Advantage. And just before the break, I was asking you about this, where you say in the book that judgments are made about us quickly and they can be difficult to shift. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, when any sort of situation that we go into, we walk into a new room and people are automatically trying to make perceptions and attributions about who we are. And, the thing is that we often passively let others write our narrative, right? When we meet someone new, we're trying to tell a story about who they are. We're trying to make sense of this person and their traits and where they've been and who they are. And others are doing that about us as well. And we often just sort of passively let others do this rather than writing our own narrative and guiding others' view of who we are. So it's so important to sort of not allow those first impressions to dominate. It's a lot harder to turn around first impressions than it is to sort of know how others see you so that you can automatically be guiding and redirecting them to how they should see you.
Yeah, I call that creating your brand by design rather than by default.
Absolutely.
It's this idea that you can't just leave your personal brand up to just unmanaged. You do have to take some action in terms of how you're seen by other people.
Yeah.
What was the most interesting finding out of the research you did in the book from your perspective? What was the thing that surprised you the most?
The thing that surprised me the most was around these sort of structural solutions that we tried, right? It's sort of this, we sort of know that there's this myth of meritocracy. And so we talk a lot about what we need to do to change the system, right? Putting in more mentors that are women or people of color, doing hiring based on algorithms, trying to eliminate bias from our hiring and our promotions and our funding and all these sort of things. And the thing is, though, we've been talking about this for a really long time. We've been talking a lot about how we need to change the system. And sometimes those systems have changed, but not in the ways that we've intended them to. They've created other issues. And sometimes they've changed, but they're changing much more slowly than we need them to. And so what was the biggest sort of realization for me is that even if the systems do change, we can't just sit around and wait for them. We need to confront them as they are. That we need to be empowering ourselves as individuals to be able to, control our own outcomes. I talk about it as, we're dealt the hand of cards that we're dealt. And, and we shouldn't be letting other people tell us that hand is a bad hand. We should be able to play those hands however we want. So it's not just about shuffling better or dealing in a certain way. It's about empowering ourselves to create our own advantage, to create our own edge, even within imperfect systems.
Well, that's a really interesting point of view because the reality is that a lot of the systems are imperfect. And I think what you're saying is you can't wait for the system to get perfect before you start taking advantage.
That's right. I mean, we know that those systems need to change, and we are trying to change them. And so it's not going to hurt by doing things like putting more mentors in and putting more women and people of color into positions, executive positions and on boards and that sort of thing. But, even when we do that, there's no guarantee that that's going to make a meritocratic system. There's still going to be imperfections. And so as individuals, we need to be able to understand how we can flip circumstances to create our own edge. We also need to understand that so much of this is individual, that there are broad generalizations and broad stereotypes, but again, there's so much nuance. And so it really needs to be this personal perspective and this where we ourselves know how are we being seen in one context versus another context, because that could shift. We also need to understand that everyone has something, right? We often talk about the fact that there are, the typical cast of characters, right? Gender, race, ethnicity, class, religion, sexual orientation. And absolutely, those are things that we are grappling with in terms of equality and in terms of disadvantage and in terms of who's underestimated. But we're in this interconnected society where we're dealing with people in all of those different categories, but we're also dealing with people who, seemingly have some advantage in some contexts and don't in other contexts. So for example, Ronan Farrow was telling me not too long ago that, he's the epitome of white cis male privilege, right?
Yeah.
He comes from a wealthy family. His mother is Mia Farrow. He's an attractive white male. But often he walks into a room and he's immediately discounted. People say things like, where they're thinking things like, you don't even deserve your Pulitzer Prize because you clearly didn't do it yourself. You're not a good writer. You only did this because, so those are perceptions that he also has to try and flip in his favor. Women need to flip it, people of color. And this is not something that's just purely overly strategic or even manipulative. We need to point people to who we authentically are.
And what are some really practical ways that you recommend people do that? Because I think in the times that we're in, like one of the things I'm advising my clients about right now is that in the time that we're in with the virus, the economic downturn, whatever the situation's going to be, your message about who you are and what you offer has to be clearer than ever.
Yeah.
You can't afford to have, as you're saying, those misconceptions, people not understand what you stand for, et cetera, et cetera. What are some of the practical ways that you discovered in writing the book that people can do that?
Yeah, this is something where I say that everyone can learn this, but not everyone is willing to. And that willingness, because that willingness comes with a lot of effort. There's a lot of effort involved we think we know ourselves, but we don't know ourselves in terms of all of the different sort of contexts that we could be in and the different people that we interact with. Who we are with our best friend is really different from who we are with our mother, from who we are with our children, from who we are with our boss. And we don't often think about the different ways that we need to be managing who we are and the perceptions that these different audiences have of us and the ways in which we need to be guiding and the different ways that we delight. And so this willingness comes with a lot of effort in terms of honing our ability to know how others perceive us. So I talk in the book about lots of different strategies and how-tos and ways that we can think about honing these sort of things. One of the things, incidentally, that I talk about is that we are very linear in terms of our thinking, not exponential. And now with this whole coronavirus thing, it's really coming to our forefront that we need to be thinking exponentially as well as linearly because it has real repercussions.
Can you just define for our listeners what you mean by thinking exponentially?
Yeah, we tend to think like if we put in X amount of effort, we'll get X amount of rewards. Or if we do, if we think in terms of how things progress, one person doing something leads to another person doing something, leads to another person leading to something. But exponential thinking is more around, if you put in that early sort of effort, it compounds over time, right? That one person doing something would then influences somebody else. But now you have two people who are then influencing others, and that turns to 4, and that turns to 8, and turns to 16, and suddenly you're in this multiplicative sort of thing. And so when we understand that, it also allows us to sort of understand how stereotypes get out of hand and how social movements sometimes get out of hand and how perception sort of compounds. But even on a more individual level, there's some exercises that I talk about that, for example, that really allow us to hone the way we understand how we're perceived and how we ourselves can use how we enrich and how we provide value, our strengths, our superpowers to really guide and create an edge. So one example of this, an exercise that I do with my students, is called the 10 no's exercise. And what it looks like is basically over the course of a week, the assignment that students have to do is they have to get 10 people to say no to them. And they have to write a paragraph about what happened in each of those situations and then pick one of those and present it to the class. And it has to be a no. It can't be like a hedge. It can't be someone be like, oh, well, I can do this for you instead. If you get that, you got to start all over. And so what this forces us to do, because it's the assignment, like students have to do this in order to get the assignment done, they're forced to figure out ways to get people to say no to them. And the thing is, in our lives, we are so used to trying to get people to say yes to us. We're so used to wanting people to say yes to us, to agree to us, to like us. And when they're forced to get people to say no to them, it's building a different type of muscle. It's forcing them to communicate in a way that they've never communicated before. It's forcing them to see the reactions of different people and how what they say and how they communicate and their style and their tone, how that really leads to other people's reactions in a whole different broad array of contexts and situations.
Can you give me an example of one of you don't have to say the student's name, but an example of that from one of your students?
Yeah, I mean, so, I have a student who worked in sales, right? And but prior to coming to get his MBA. And so much of his repertoire was around, knowing what his initial stance was, trying to understand that, sort of knowing where he would make concessions, using sort of a style that tried to first get to know that person and put that other person at ease and find a point of connection. And all of a sudden, he sort of, in his presentation, he was like, I realized that so much of what I was doing was in a certain tone and a certain style. And this was the critical piece of it, is that he used that style with certain people, with people that looked like him, that acted like him. And then he used a different style with people who he was unfamiliar with, that looked very different from him, who had a different background from him. And so then when he sort of was like, well, now I need to get a no from people who both look like me and people who don't look like me. And he found that, some of the ways that he formed a connection with the people that didn't look like him, where he thought he was going to get a no, actually really gave him a deeper connection with that person in trying to get that no, in trying different tactics. He also realized, for example, that people are much more willing to say yes to him than he thought. There were things that he could ask that he thought for sure would be a no. But in fact, they still said yes. Whereas other people, they would absolutely have gotten a no in those situations. And so sort of comparing those experiences with different people, this particular student actually ended up getting Super Bowl tickets. Like he said, I asked somebody for their Super Bowl tickets and they said yes. And he was like, God. I was floored.
What? Yeah. And what is the purpose of that exercise? Like, what do you think people can learn from that exercise?
Well, we don't always know what our underestimated strengths are and what our weaknesses are. We don't always understand what are the basic things that we're good at. We think we know, but we don't really understand how different people react to us and how we sort of interact with other people. It just gives us another perspective that we haven't really had the opportunity to.
I'm not sure I understand. I love the idea of it. I'm not sure I understand the connection between getting people to say no and learning what you just said people can learn from it.
Well, it differs for everyone, right? So it's not really like, here are the 3 things that you learn, right? It's going through this exercise. It's such a personal thing because we are being perceived. People are making attributions of me very differently than they're making perceptions and attributions of you. And so it's a tool for honing the way in which you see a different aspect of yourself, right? For me, for example, I walk into a room and, for example, I was doing lots of research with venture capitalists and walked into a lot of venture capitalists who immediately discounted me. They said, how could, as a young Asian female, how could you know anything about the entrepreneurship ecosystem? And I learned that, I needed to start with things like my quantitative background. That made sense, right? Being Asian and having a quantitative background. And then they would be like, oh, well, can you tell me about my decision making and how I'm using the analysis to make my decisions? That may not be the case for somebody else. But when I go in and I'm trying to get a no from somebody, it shows me, it sort of highlights to me different aspects of myself that I didn't quite understand. Qualities around things like they expect me to be super organized and have an agenda and go in there with, but when I wouldn't have necessarily seen that if I didn't try and put myself in these positions where I'm creating these barriers for myself. I'm trying to get that no. For you, it might be something very, very different. And so it's not so much the three things you learn are X, Y, and Z, but it's different for everyone.
Well, and I think what's interesting about that is that it's a way in for people to see how they might shift the way they are talking about something or presenting what they do or presenting who they are. And even in these times, and I think what you said is really true, is as Americans, and this might be true for other parts of the world as well, but for sure I know it's true for Americans. As Americans, we are just all about getting the yes.
Yeah. I mean,
right?
we don't do enough of sort of this mirroring. Like, how do they see you? Given their upbringing, the environment they're in, the people they're around, how do they see someone with your upbringing, someone who's been in the environments you've been in, your background? So we don't do enough of that sort of back and forth, like who I am and who you are, and that space in between. Another sort of simple exercise that I do, which is sort of similar to this, is like when you're asking for something, when you're asking someone for something over email, for example, instead of writing that email to them saying like, dear so-and-so, here's what I would like from you. Pretend that person is writing an email to you, asking you for that very thing. Put yourself in the place of that person who is getting your request and write the email you would want to read. So that gives you another perspective of why would they want to do it? What's the difference between you and them? And how do we try and get someone's buy-in when we're trying to convince people or persuade them on something that we think they feel differently about?
Yeah, that's great. I love that turnaround. That's fabulous. Given all the things that are going on right now, again, the coronavirus, the economic downturn, etc., what, in your opinion, is the one most important thing that that small business owners, entrepreneurs need to do that you've learned from your research in your book? What is the most important thing you think they need to do right now, given the situation?
So I think that there's a lot of different strategies that small businesses are trying to take based on where they're at and based on what they're sort of going through. I mean, I think most small businesses, it's really about staying afloat at this point. So we see a majority really just trying to keep their bread and butter, stay afloat, and weather this storm. There's other small businesses that are trying to sort of not capitalize on this in a negative sense, but trying to see where that opportunity is. And I don't necessarily think that's wrong, but we need to be careful as small businesses who don't have a lot of, that don't have a huge buffer, that we're not completely changing what it is we do in such a way that it's going to create a lot more work and effort and not allow us to reap the benefits of that on a long-term basis. So I think it's this balance of understanding what are the basics that you need to maintain, and where do you sort of see those other opportunities. What I think is especially sort of sad and saddens me is that we also don't necessarily always think about the differences between all of the various different types of small businesses that are out there. Everything from independent contractors to brick and mortar to online small businesses to, outsourced businesses to, Lyft and Uber drivers and delivery. They're not all the same. And so each of them has a different set of constraints and a different set of barriers that they need to overcome. There's also a lot of small businesses who have a lot more buffer, and those are going to be completely fine, right? It's sort of like in situations like this, the people who have a who have that buffer are going to be fine. But it's the people who are sort of struggling already, that were just getting off the ground or just starting to get to this equilibrium, that this is just another blow that's becoming increasingly hard for them to sort of get through. So I think we need to make sure that we think about this in a much more holistic way, rather than just sort of saying, I mean, I certainly applaud efforts around, sort of UBI and universal basic income and those sorts of things, where let's sort of make infusions, $1,000 infusions into small businesses and into the hands of individuals.
But it's not a long-term solution.
It's not a long-term solution, and it can't be the same solution for everyone.
That's a good point.
So we need to be able to sort of infuse the small businesses with all these sorts of things. And, my friend Andrew Chow, who is a small business owner, he's the founder of this company called Boba Guys. He's been doing a lot in DC to try and get these exact points out, that we need to be able to help small businesses create their own opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting because I completely agree with you. And in the coaching that I've done with small businesses around this issue, that's exactly what I've said, is you have to figure out what your long-term is going to be, not just relying on that possible infusion of cash, because that's only going to take us so far. But, I think it is an ecosystem. And I think one of the things, like, for example, I know I've been going out of my way to do things for clients without charging them. Like my clients can all call me and just have a conversation to get support. I've been going to some of my clients, my vendors, and saying, hey, this is what I need from you. And by the way, it's dividing into two camps. The people that are being totally unhelpful as vendors, who I've worked with forever, and the people that are being totally helpful. And I can tell you, when this is all over, who's going to stay are the people that have been totally helpful, and the people that are not going to stay, that I'm not going to keep using, are the people that just treated it as business as usual and were not helpful. And I think that's a real danger. People don't realize they're running. And one of the things, and you see this on a much bigger scale, is I was in the a little bodega here in New York the other day, and I went to buy something. I can't remember what it was. And they had these little single packets of Purell, and they were like $6 each. And I said to the guy, $6 for one little thing? And he said, yeah, the Purell company has been raising prices. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. He said, no. And I thought, that is one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, desperate times, you see, a lot of, this happens. But we see this in everyday situations as well, where we need to be able to, not just in sort of crisis situations such as the one we're in now. I mean, for years, we were talking about how, companies were price gauging the price of insulin. And there were people who had diabetes who couldn't afford insulin. So they were sort of having their, taking only half of what they needed so that they could make it last longer and these sorts of things. So I think, you and I have talked before around like how we need to think about how this is going to affect us even after all of this is sort of over. Right now we're in this situation. We're just trying to stop the bleeding. And
by the way, I also just want to clarify that it's not Purell, the company, that's raising those prices necessarily. It's people buying them and then price gouging. So I didn't want to, it's not the company itself, but people buying it and price gouging. Like I read something where a bottle of Purell was selling on Amazon for $250.
Yeah, I mean, it happens all through sort of it happens all sort of through the supply chain, and this is where it's so critical for us. And I've struggled with this because I'm like, what is the solution? I mean, so much of this, I think we just need to have. We need to have strong leadership. We need to have strong leadership. We need to have people being informed in ways that is going to be, both beneficial individually as well as collectively. We need to make sure that people are sort of understanding, because some of these, I look at some of these and I'm like, you know what? We also don't know, like some of these people along the supply chain are maybe desperate themselves. Like maybe their family is has lost their jobs. And so they're like, we need to sort of recoup what we've lost. And then that has trickle down effects, because then other people are overpaying for Purell and these sorts of things. So we need to sort of have a much more macro understanding of the forces that are the social forces and what's sort of happening, and having strong leadership and strong leadership and strong processes and structures in place, so that we can sort of from the outside in be empowering people as well as from the inside out.
Yeah, and I think it also points out that we really are connected. As much as people might want to say we're not connected, it is clearly not true. And if anything has shown it, it's this. Borders are a abstract concept in some ways.
Yeah.
And it's really like we all succeed or none of us succeed. I think that's become really clear in this.
And I think this is, I think we, in terms of, we need to be able to prevent against these sorts of situations. But, sort of the message that I also have been saying is we cannot be in the blame game right now.
No.
We cannot be blaming. Blaming is not going to make this go away. Blaming is something that needs to be productive in a way that we prevent this in the future after we've stopped the current bleeding. So right now, we just need to stop the bleeding. And by blaming, by, sort of all of the horrific things that I'm seeing in the news around attributing, the anti-Asian sort of sentiments, we need to stick together here. We're only going to crush this when we're creatively thinking about solutions
together
to sort of help each of us, help ourselves by helping everybody else.
And I couldn't put it any better myself. Laura, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure chatting with you.
You too. So my guest today has been Laura Huang. She is a professor at Harvard Business School, and she is the author of the new book, Edge, Turning Adversity into Advantage. I assume people can go on Amazon.com and get the book, correct?
Yes, although I'm hearing that Amazon is sort of overwhelmed these days.
Okay.
So there's also an Audible version and there's also a Kindle version. So
Great.
I would say, and also support your local bookstores.
Great.
There's so many local bookstores that are carrying this and could really use your help as well. But
perfect.
Thank you for your support.
My pleasure. Thank you. All right, everyone. This has been Thought Talk. Stay safe and just keep doing what you do. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Thought Talk with branding and marketing strategist Karen Tiber Leland, founder of Sterling Marketing Group and author of The Brand Mapping Strategy, Design, Build, and Accelerate Your Brand. To find out more about this podcast or how you can work with Karen on your business, team, or personal brand, contact www.sterlingmarketinggroup.com.